Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon.
Well, by now, you may have noticed that I have a devoted interest in practice, the nature of practice, and the way I'm learning about it is through conversations with interesting practitioners. In fact, being a practitioner is what makes people quite interesting because they've committed themselves to achieving results over an indefinite period of time, learning and growing doing it. So I reached back to some of the folks that I met in earlier episodes, like Don Dunoon, who is in this conversation, and I say, Don, it's been a while, been over a year. Let's talk about what leadership, which is his passion, similar to my passion for practice, what leadership is meaning to you now. What have you discovered? What are you sharing that will add to the richness of our understanding of leadership? You'll be listening to what he says, and it's very gratifying to me because it resonates with my philosophy of practice. And so simpatico is what you'll hear in this conversation. Well, folks, for the hundreds, thousands, or maybe the few of you who have listened to every episode in the Practice Podcast series, you might have come across a conversation I had with Don Dunoon. He in Australia and I in Connecticut. I remember that. It was done, at least a year ago, around now. And I remembered it because I was so much in admiration of how Don has committed himself to the maddening study of leadership and trying to understand it in new and classical ways, but also working on the challenge that I face in having people understand practice, which is how can we take something that is enormously complex, put it in front of you with a little bit of a teaser of what we think leadership is and what we'd like to do with it. And so we're giving it another shot because Don is such a delightful person. Don, remind me first of the name of your book, because it's still out there and it has lived with you for quite a while.
Thank you, Dave, and it's a great pleasure to be on your podcast again. The book was called In the Leadership Mode. It came out back in 2008, and it represented the distillation of a whole lot of ideas I'd developed over the preceding 15 years or so. But what surprises me, though, another 15 years on, is that maybe it's just that I'm stuck in the mud, but I actually think those ideas stand up pretty well and that they're relevant to leadership and to the practice of leadership just about as much as they were then. The book was an outlier at the time. There were few, if any, books exploring the notion of leadership as a practice. And while there are others in this little genre, there are not too many. So I think it's still got some currency.
Yeah, no, that's probably why I noticed you in the first place. It's something you may have posted on LinkedIn, Leadership as Practice. It reminded me of another podcast episode with Joe Rayland here in the States and also South Africa, who has really, really developed a suite of ideas and given some leadership to this notion that collectively leadership can be practiced. In fact, probably it doesn't happen unless there's two or more people responding to the idea of leadership. But you and I agreed then, and I agree now, there's so much that makes us think that leading is someone who's taller than everyone else and more articulate than everyone else and has all these traits that have been identified in classic research that you should have as a leader, or you're not a leader, you're a follower. That always bugged me. Didn't it bug you? Isn't that sort of been stuck in your craw all these years? The great man theory. Yeah.
Yeah, the great man or great person theory. The notion that we focus on leaders at all, so that the starting point for discussions about leadership is often the leader. And as you say, great person, exceptional in some or other ways. And so when we think of leader, we by extension think of followers, and we're instantly categorizing people into one of two groups. And if you're a leader, then you're either born with it or you've got some natural qualities. So the question of practice doesn't really arise.
Yeah, it just happens, right?
Yeah. And the notion, there's a lot of interest in what's called followership these days. I struggle to make sense of that term. For me, followership implies a notion of leadership that's grounded in leadership as authority. In other words, it's only when leaders occupy positions of authority that the question of following comes in. And there's another presumption there that the leader knows, that the follower dutifully goes along with the leader because the leader has, more insight, more knowledge, and what have you. But in the world we're living in, where challenges are complex, multifaceted, no one's got all the answers. And the notion that leadership only resides at the top with designated leaders who are, exceptional people, often in positions of authority, it's really of another time. And I think so back in the book, I talked about a forest of leadership as representing all the books and resources and materials, videos and what have you that have been produced on leadership over the 50 years or so.
Thousands and thousands and thousands of
thousands and thousands. And so the tall trees represent the big, well-regarded books, the James McGregor Burns transformation leadership, the idea of transformational leadership. And there's a whole lot of sort of lower level growth representing, articles and frameworks and tools and what have you. But through that forest of leadership run these vines. And the vines represent established assumptions about leadership that kind of choke the whole forest. They're totally pervasive. They wrap themselves around everything. So the idea of leadership being grounded in the leader, that leaders are people in authority, and that leadership is an influence process. They strangled the forest, those assumptions. Now, what got me thinking about this was the discovery back in 1994 of a tree that had previously been thought to only exist in fossilised form, the Wallamai pine, discovered in a national park west of Sydney. And there was a stand of these trees growing that one park ranger recognised as distinct. But no one had ever noticed them before because there's so much other stuff in the forest.
Yeah.
It's a bit like my question has been, could it be that there's a Wallamai pine of leadership, right? A different way of looking at leadership that you can't see in the forest because there's so much entanglement with these vines of, the leader, authority, and influence.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was interested to sort of think about, what this different form of leadership might look like, especially a form of leadership that's highly practical, highly useful, but is not centered in these traditional ideas. And
you just struck yourself quite a challenge there, Don, back then. But I love it. I love the fact that you asked such a big question. What if? Is there any way that we can get through the thicket and find out how leading really happens? And that must have set you on quite a what do they think of Outback? Quite a quest.
well, it has been quite a quest. Just one term I'd pick up on though, Dave, and that's the term leading. So to me, and I'm not suggesting you're using it in this way, but leading often means, the leader, the person kind of out front, setting the path for others. Whereas for me, leadership as a process involves joint exploration, people thinking together about vexing issues. So a group, so what I call learning-centered leadership, which is, chapter 2 of the book, goes to the idea that, we're dealing with contentious issues. We've got to make meaning out of those issues. We've got to think about, what's our purpose? What are we trying to achieve here? What's really going on now? What's the sort of complexity around the current situation, the differing stakeholder perspectives, the data points we might not be picking up on? What's our vision? Where do we kind of need to go with this? And so there's 2 levels of this. I thought of it as like 2 lenses, right? So there's the work a group has to do over a period, which I sort of talk of as the higher level lens. It's the lens of the telescope, if you like. It's sort of looking into the distance.
Yes.
Thinking together as a group. And this is probably around closer to the collective leadership that Joe Raylan would be talking about. But there's another form, which is a very micro, it's like looking through the microscope. It's really kind of here and now into the detail. Interventions happening in particular moments that individuals can make to contribute to the group's work of making sense of an issue over a period. And that might be as simple as asking a question that alerts the group to the prospect that perhaps there's a shared assumption that people are making that might usefully be identified and unravelled. Or it might be speaking up to argue a contrary view. But it's an intervention made in a point of time, intended to help the group sort of shift its thinking. It's a contribution to this larger group work over a period of clarifying purpose and vision and direction and enabling change on the desired path. So that's the notion of being in the leadership mode. And the proposition is it's different to leading in the sense that it doesn't require, the person to be out front and taking the group somewhere in a sustained sort of way. It might just be a momentary action. It might come from a person or persons who don't in any way self-define as leaders. Right? They don't leaders. They're just members of the group. But they are making a leadership intervention at a point in time. And when I've put this to people, participants in my workshops, that actually what you're doing there is it's kind of leadership work. And they go, but I'm not a leader. Well, that's not. There
you go. You see how conditioned folks are.
Absolutely.
You said I was leading. I'm not a leader, but they were. I get it very, very, very well. Yeah, it does require. Here's the dilemma that I'm feeling already. So we take that person who was in the moment and made a keen observation that started to move people's attention away from whatever they were attending to and into something new, a leadership moment. And we want to honor that person. But the dilemma that I'm seeing is, we've got to elevate that person now into a hero. Now we've got to pull that person up and say, look what Betty did when she said that, and it changed us just in time. I don't have any problem giving Betty honor, but in a way, it kind of throws us back to the old paradigm. Betty must get a promotion, and next she'll be a supervisor and all that. And I always really struggled, even in my first book, Inside Knowledge, with the fact that I had a call center person in inside sales as my heroine. And she sat there with a headset on and took calls and made deals with business buyers. And I remember saying, now I'd love to make even her more a heroine, but if I had taken Dana out and elevated her into a formal position during the story I'm telling, it would essentially diminish everyone else that she was in conversation with, who made the ultimate difference in solving the mystery of my book. It took conversation with all sorts of folks who had absolutely inglorious titles, nothing that's, was supposed to give them a place in the hierarchy. Yet together, they knew something was going wrong, something wrong was being done. And they sort of like, do you see what I see? And then should I risk, telling management about this problem? Oh, I don't know. I think you better not. That kind of thing that goes on all the time.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, just on the question of making a hero out of Betty, your person there.
Yeah.
To my mind, well, we want to acknowledge the contribution people make, but hopefully, lots of people are making contributions. I mean, if Betty is performing well in all aspects of a job, she may well, warrant a promotion. But if she's promoted, then, and she goes into a more senior role, because she's done a few things other than make a useful intervention in a conversation, even if she gets promoted all the way up the line and becomes a recognised organisational leader, that doesn't necessarily mean she's doing much leadership. Do you know what I mean? The force of the title. So I think it's important that we differentiate the holder, the being in an office, being a leader, and the work one does. And it's not, it's been my experience on many occasions of talking to very senior people in organisations and asking them about the leadership that happens there. And they'll say things like, we've got leaders here, but you don't actually see much leadership in practice.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the question becomes, what does leadership practice actually look like? And how might we differentiate that from the context of what else is going on? Mm-hmm. And because leadership work, like any practice, is contextualized. There's other things happening at the time. And if we're going to think about leadership as a form of work, we need to think, well, what's that in relation to? What is not leadership, if you like?
That's good. That's it. That's a good question.
Leadership is, right? And so for me, one of the distinctions was made by Ronald Heifetz, the Harvard Kennedy School scholar who is a great force in this area of leadership as practice. And he talks about, well, firstly, the differences between leadership and authority that I thoroughly agree with, but also the distinction between leadership and technical work. Solving problems with sort of known protocols, getting work done, but where there's a kind of a known way, even if the individual doesn't personally know the way, they know somebody who does. Mm-hmm. Now, so leadership is not technical work, but for me, it's not management. And we did talk about this in our last conversation. But thinking about leadership as a practice that's overlapping with, but at least to some degree distinct from management, is useful as well. Because when you're talking to senior people in organisations and you ask them, what do the senior people actually do? They say things like, well, we review programs and we monitor budgets and we make sure deadlines are met and we, communicate with stakeholders. And I think, okay, much of that sounds more like management work.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So we need to disentangle the two modes of action if we're to have a clear line of sight on leadership as a practice. That's a kind of an important proposition for me. And can I just add, Dave?
Please do.
Yeah. So one difficulty is often that when you talk with senior people about the practice of leadership, it's a conversation they often find a little uncomfortable because they don't necessarily reflect a lot on their own practice. They think of leadership development as developing other people down the line. I'm a leader. I've made it. I don't need to think about my practice.
Yeah. Now prepare these people, for the climb.
Exactly.
they single out, and now this person has potential as a leader, and then they want to put them in the various workshops and develop them. And I'm okay with that. I think you are too. I mean, it works, but it's not enough. And I think that's what you said earlier in our conversation, that the speed of change, the need to be more agile, more responsive, as well as progressive in regard to how you keep customers, which seems to be a very big challenge these days. The customers are leaving you before you notice. So why wasn't that noticed? Well, if you talk to people on the shop floor, they noticed. You talk to the people in the call center, they noticed. Well, why didn't you say anything? Well, I thought you were the ones who had the overview. You should have been. You got the data sets. we submitted your reports. So really, what in the meantime, to somehow, and I've this is an overworked word, but to empower, something that was very strong in the quality movement, empower the people doing the work and give them what they need, the information and tools, and then let them grow the work. That was a wonderful philosophy. It got somewhat truncated as time goes on.
But it's still absolutely relevant.
Call it a fad, or quality is dead, and all that baloney. But what was really working, and when I was working very closely in the quality question in a hospital, for example, what really was working was just what you have written about and you're talking about now, that the woman who happened to be in the hospital room cleaning, there's a patient in the bed, and she noticed that the patient was going into crisis, and she acted, and she had the trust of the others and the registered nurses and others on the floor. They assembled. They did not then say, "Okay, Betty, you're done." Here's Betty again. It will take over. They would keep Betty in the picture, and in the diagnosis of what was going on. Tell us more about what you heard and saw. Betty had the firsthand observation of the symptom that they were observing on the bed, and that was culture. And that happened to be a very special hospital, but it was culture. So when I would hear situations like that, and then I'd go back in my working as an inside consultant to the management team, I would tell them those stories, and they would get it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the power of the intelligence that people have on frontline jobs, whether they're in cleaning roles or more technical roles or whatever it is so incredibly underestimated. Yeah. Assumptions are made all the way up organisations that, wisdom resides at the top, and the people at the top ought to know and the people down the line receive. But if we think about complex organisations, and just to go back to your example of customers are leaving, and people are noticing that on the front line, it's a leadership intervention potentially for someone to call out what's actually happening. What is the pattern? What are we noticing here? And it takes courage to do that, because the culture probably doesn't reward it. So practice of leadership is, tends to be countercultural, because it's about doing things that are not part of the usual way things are done. And
yes,
there are likely to be kind of underground implicit rules. Oh, you don't challenge authority, or you don't provide, information that's going to be discomforting up the line. But it's when people do that, the organisation potentially is tapping more and more of its intelligence, its collective intelligence, which it needs to do to be successful, in contemporary environments. So it goes to the idea that we need leadership to be widely dispersed. It needs to be a property of the system. Again, probably something I imagine Joe Rowland would agree with, rather than confined, to a few people. And it's different from what's often termed distributed leadership. Now, that's a term that in the UK in the early 2000s, and especially in the school sector, became really big. But distributed leadership can mean a kind of a parceling out.
Yeah, it's a power game. Yeah.
Yeah, people at the top allocating responsibilities. You look after this program and you keep an eye on that. And, it's kind of a contemporary word for what might have been termed delegation in the 90s.
Yeah.
But often it's a sort of more of a management take on leadership, because it's about, exercising authority and responsibility within a defined area, rather than people pushing against their job description and doing the unexpected, really taking personal responsibility to call out something or ask difficult questions. That's not usually what's implied in the term distributed leadership.
No. I was rethinking with you the notion of distribution, which is a power down, and the fact that some people might be reluctant to have that distributed to them. They don't ready, they're not developed. So what did you call, and that's what I was trying to remember, what did you call it instead of distributed leadership?
Well, I use the word dispersed, which means that leadership appears in all sorts of places. It's evident when you look around the organisation, rather than it's being allocated or apportioned.
Oh, I love that.
Some central place.
That's a great image. We could make a whole movie around that. In fact, probably a lot of movies inadvertently have done that, because they have a scene and then somehow the scene has a resolution, and then you look at it and say, how did that happen? And they didn't even have the boss in the room. But they got together, and the old Andy Rooney movies, hey gang, there's a barn and we can sing, let's put on a show. That kind of spirit. You sing and you do the scenes and everything, and it got dispersed. And then this show would evolve. I remember watching those movies and Turner Classic here in the States and thinking, that they really did honor the potential of teens in those shows, that they could find ways to get things done.
Absolutely. And I think the notion of psychological safety is pretty important here, because a lot of what stops people in teams undertaking the kinds of things they could potentially do is the fear of what might happen were they to, cross some sort of unwritten rule. So the idea that every formal holder of office in an organisation, I would encourage to work on the assumption that people underneath me probably feel unsafe, and that part of, just by virtue of the fact that I hold authority over them and I can, make calls that affect their future. And so part of leadership as a practice is seeking to work in a way with one's colleagues, one's own team members, that's more dialogic, collegial. It's being able to recognise what are those times when I really do need to be in authority. I need to make those tough calls. I need to make uncomfortable decisions, as distinct from the times when we just need to talk together as human beings that share a common interest about working through an issue. And to regard that notion of psychological safety as problematic and ever-present, and to work at one's own practice, to seek feedback, to notice, for example, I'm thinking of a manager recently who told me, I'm very open with my team. I have an open door policy. They're welcome to come in at any time. And I said, well, but do they come in? He said, not so often. They don't. And so it's tuning, it's being mindful, it's tuning in to the observable data. Well, I'm saying on the one hand that I've got an open door policy, but very few people actually come in the door. Those are sort of two conflicting data points. And to kind of interrogate that on the presumption that there might be an issue with my exercise of authority. They might feel unsafe or a bit vulnerable or a bit wary. And so the work of leadership is testing these things the whole time, taking these data points, thinking about what's your hypothesis about this, and kind of putting it out there. Now, there is a lot of work for most organizations in this space, I think, because it kind of folds back to our three vines of leadership, right? The default ideas about leaders, influence, and authority. Because if we talk about dispersed leadership, we want leadership throughout the organization because we know that's what the organization needs to be successful. We then have individual managers, authority holders, who likely say things like, but I don't want a whole lot of leaders under me because they'll each be going off and, doing their own thing. And that will create chaos, and we won't be following the plan.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, one does need to balance the leadership work and the management work. There do need to be some negotiated boundaries and so on. We're not just saying in the notion of distributed leadership, everyone go off and do whatever they like, right? There is a larger purpose.
But I think you presented a key word to me when you said leadership has to be systemic. It has to be throughout the system. So managers can be responsible, if you will, for a system within the larger system.
Yeah.
This is my system overall. But now, how do I make sure that leading is going on throughout my system? That's a lot different than saying, let's let everyone have the keys to the treasure chest. It says, let's work with people so that together we'll identify how the system can be infused with leadership. Now, I think it's exquisitely human, not technical, that leadership is a human fact of activity, and it's usually imparted through conversation, something you and I talked about in the first episode. So making that more visual for people, little spots of leadership pop, however you want to display it, gets them thinking, well, let's just say that leadership is for the moment, a torchlight going up through the dark. And if you were to walk into proximity to that light and others were drawn to it, now you'd have this spear of light going up, of insight, of energy, of enthusiasm. And what if it's not a torch at all, but it's Betty, our Betty, who had this moment of brilliance, actually, and others were attracted to it, and then they took it. And so I think the way that you and I have, and I think we very much share the same philosophy of leadership, is we want to honor the Bettys and the Bobs who appear all over a particular system in their day.
I love that idea, Dave, and especially the notion of making leadership visible. So it's recognizing those instances when someone does something that's a bit out of the ordinary. They highlight an issue that no one else has raised. They question an organizational assumption. They engage people whose voices aren't ordinarily heard. That if organizations could get better at just isolating when those things happen and recognizing them and celebrating them and giving them a bit of profile, we don't have to make heroes out of the individuals. No. It's more noticing the instance and saying, hey, Betty or Bob did something really interesting there.
Yeah.
Let's draw attention to that. So sort of practice can be normalized and made, over time, a property of the system rather than of the few exceptional people.
Yeah, and then it becomes part of the culture as well, because there's an acceptance that the system of leading that's going on, associated with whoever is in that moment, together And now you don't have to look specifically at Betty and Bob. As I hear you saying, Don, you say, let's look at what happened for our organization, or for the flow of work, or for the avoidance of trouble, and celebrate how we collectively in the system of leadership kept our organization moving forward without too much trouble. It seems like, look at us. We're just moving. How come we're moving? Well, it's leading.
So it is both the collective and the individual aspects for me.
Yes.
So it's recognizing that, you do need the village of the organization active. You need to get, people broadly involved, but it's the specific instances where individuals take action that, noticeably nudges things in a different way. I think both of those need to be paid attention to. Now, something that's kind of happened in the leadership literature is we've traditionally had a focus on, as you said before, the great individual, very much been personal role-centered. And so there's been, as a kind of push against that, there's been an emphasis on the collective, on the assumption that if we talk about the individual, we're reinstitutionalizing, the great person or the entity of the leader. Well, we don't want to do that, but we can recognize individuals in the moment as making specific interventions, and that's worthwhile and significant. And we ought to be able to hold those individual interventions with the collective, leadership as a property of the system. So I think both of those are really important. But unfortunately, we've gotten into a bit of a binary way of seeing where it's either the great person or it's the collective. Well, I think we can be a bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah. And now as I'm watching the clock and I'm loving this conversation, I wonder, with this sense that we're sharing now with our listeners, that should be happening, what can we who are talking about leadership and writing about it, what can we do? What can we offer from the outside in to encourage those celebrations of those intervention moments and making them more real to people? In other words, what's the role for us out here to make more of this happen?
Yeah, it's not an easy one, but it is, I think, working with organisations to encourage that sort of reflective spirit where they think about what are some of the significant things that have happened in their journey, and if they could really zoom in on, particular actions that contributed to that, and think about, I guess, David, goes to a fairly fundamental rethink of, what we mean by leadership development, and that it's not just about sending, a few selected individuals off to a program where they learn about theories of leadership and they, are exposed to highly influential individuals and, they do personality assessments. So that it actually becomes more of a, and I don't know how much the role here is for external people, but it's maybe to lubricate the processes where within organisations they can just start the conversation internally about how do we understand leadership. Well, for us to think about leadership as a property of the system, what would that kind of mean for us? What sorts of things do we see and would we hope to see that reflect leadership and action by lots of people? And getting the conversation going in that sort of direction, can become self-sustaining. But actually, kickstarting it is not easy. But hopefully conversations like this one, Dave, the more people talk about these things, the more likely it is to happen.
I agree. And I think it's been a little more than a year, Don. And look at what's happened in a year's time in this world, good and bad and horrible. We talk about change as, change. Well, change is changing. And And I think there's more of a shared will now to find out to make our organizations more leaderly, which is one of Raylan's concept. I can't say it, but it's a great idea. Leaderly. We have to amp up the leadership phenomenon overall. Yeah. Why? Because there's no organization on earth that can be untouched now by the buffets and the slams and the drops and the rises that is external to these organizations. And it certainly works within. So, hey, maybe Don Dunoon, our time has come.
well, perhaps so, Dave. I remain optimistic that there are people in organizations that do recognize, look, we invest quite a lot in leadership development. Maybe we need to, rethink how we allocate that expenditure. And instead of thinking we're doing leadership development just by sending people off to external programs, expensive external programs, maybe we need to focus on growing our collective and individual practice internally. And, without making a huge deal about it, it's in the notion of practice, Dave. You've got to work at it. You've got to keep working at it.
That's right. That's right. And you need, perhaps it doesn't hurt to have on-site some coaching, some people who take a particular personal responsibility or even official responsibility to kind of look at the caliber of what's happening in the leading part of that system, and then being close so they can seize those moments and they can reinforce them. And what did you learn here? How can we get this learning spread quickly throughout? Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a whole new agent, if you will, of a leadership developer who is and will develop those agents. We'll say, we'll come in and we'll sensitize a group of people, even randomly selected, and say, in addition to your duties, and perhaps for a little bit more compensation, you will look out for and be ready to not pounce on what's being done wrong, but embrace what's being done right and make sure everyone notices it. It'd be a very interesting kind of character, but I think who knows? You and I, and all those of us who are interested in advancing leadership development, ought to be having conversations just like this. We ought to be busting our heads against the hard wall of the old notions of leadership together, and then embracing each other and saying, "Has anyone got an idea here?
Yeah. No.
Anyone have a new metaphor? Does anyone have a force in Australia that can get us out of this headset and into something more fluid?"
I love what you're saying there, Dave. And there's one practice that I think is really, really important in all of this. And it's based on the work of Ellen Langer, the Harvard psychologist and mindfulness scholar, with whom I was delighted and honoured to be able to collaborate a decade or more ago on an article.
Wonderful.
But Langer emphasises the importance of noticing. Noticing is distinct from reacting and judging. And so when people look at what's happening in their organisations, to be able to notice rather than rush to an evaluation, instead of saying that was done wrong, that's not how you should do it. Instead, maybe to say, well, the procedure says we do X, Y, and Z here, but I noticed that step X wasn't done on this occasion. That's observable. How can we make sense of that? How can we understand it? How can we learn from it? So if we could cultivate that spirit of observation without reaction and judgment, just generating data that we can make sense of in different ways without rushing to find fault and attribute blame, I think we'd start to get a lot more traction.
Oh, I love it. I love this. It reminds me of a conversation I had in an episode with a gentleman named John Hibbs, who is on the island of Guernsey and has founded a company called Coefficient. And they've come up with some software that identifies what is going on from up through the the toes of roots of people. What are they observing categorically? Do they notice this? And then it's going to be amalgamated into something that can be put in the hands of organization consultants or leadership developers. It's still in the very early stages, but it reminds me very much of what you and I have talked about. So here I am in Connecticut, connecting with two very forward-thinking people who care a lot about the people of an organization, all of the people of an organization. And I honor you for that, Don Dunoon.
Oh, thank you, Dave. It's been my pleasure to speak with you. Just one other thing I might throw in if I can, just to pick up on the, in addition to noticing and working from observation, I think there are a couple of other practices that are worth cultivating, and they go to the 3 guidelines that I talked about at the end of chapter 5 in my book back in 2008. So working from observation, generating data is the first one. The second one is attributing reasonableness, and that's really working on the presumption that other people have got a way of making sense of an issue that seems sensible to them, that they wouldn't be doing what they were doing unless it seemed reasonable. And so, instead of judging people as we're so prone to do, to really step back and, try and do that shift of perspective, to take their perspective, to step into their shoes and imagine their reality, and then test our hypotheses. But in order to test our hypotheses, we've got to avoid judgment. It's not that they're being self-interested, but they're doing this for, some reason that makes sense to them. We need to understand what that is.
Oh, man. Reasonableness. I yearn for it. And I agree with you. I see what you're saying. And if we just give people not the benefit of doubt, but the benefit of certainty. What do I mean by that? Just popped into my head. I'm certain that what you're seeing and telling us and what you're doing is meaningful to you, and you don't do it just for yourself. You're doing it for the benefit of others. So I'm giving you the benefit of certainty. And in these days, that's quite a big gift, isn't it?
Well,
rather than to come in and say, ooh, I don't know. I mean, I would have to think about that. I'll take it in under advisement, blah, blah, blah. What about just saying, yes? Yes.
Dave, maybe I'm not as generous as you. I don't know that I'd personally go to certainty, but I certainly agree with the benefit of the doubt. So I'd be saying, I'm working on the presumption that this makes sense to you. And let's just see where that goes. Let's just explore that. And it's when we work from a data perspective that we're observant, working from observation, when we attribute reasonableness, then we create the conditions under which our authentic voice can flow forth. We can be authentic because we're not reacting to stuff, we're not judging other people. And as long as we're talking about what's true for us in a way that's not adversely negative about others, we should be quite safe to say what we want to say. And I think if we can help people in organisations feel safer to let their voice flow forth, we'll hear a lot more interesting stuff and potentially solve a bunch more problems. So
there is the tagline for the whole conversation. Hear more interesting stuff and solve more problems. Now, who out there would not want that to happen in their company, in their agency, in their family? And I think we're onto something. So Don Dunoon, all the way from Australia, I thank you for this conversation.
It's been a great pleasure, Dave. Really enjoyed it. And it reminds me it's the power of conversation, because it's your questions were sparking thoughts in my mind that took me to places I didn't expect to go. It's just lovely to have been part of it. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. The power of conversation.
Great.
Thanks for listening to the Practice Podcast, where we discuss practice with a capital P. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to inactionresearch.com/podcasts-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Oh, and one more thing. How could I forget? The book On Practice as a Way of Being is available now in digital form, something that would be new, like podcasting to many of us. And it's a great way of learning more and more about what this podcast presented when Peter Vale and I originated it several years ago. So please come to www.mylibrary.world/practice, and you'll see what I mean. Thank you.